So we'll continue with our discussion of microcredit in developing countries. And as I mentioned, a whole spate of microcredit programs emerged in the 1980s, led by the success and publicity surrounding Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. And so development organizations all over the world emulated the model. And there was an enormous expansion, sometimes called the microfinance revolution, that took place in the 1990s and the 2000s. Many of these organizations had extremely low rates of default, in stark contrast to the credit cooperatives that were popular in the 1970s. Uh, Primarily because of these innovations in how the finance was organized that I talked about earlier in part one. So as these programs increased in popularity, of course, economists and development workers turned to evaluations of these programs. Just how successful were they at achieving their outcomes, their intended outcomes? Some people argued, well, that's irrelevant because if they meet the market test, that is, if people are borrowing, repaying, and continuing to borrow, and the microfinance organizations continue to be in business, then by a kind of revealed preference argument in a market economy, if people are choosing to engage in this activity voluntarily, then it must be because they value the activity more than the cost. And so it's a win-win for everyone, like any market transaction, and there really isn't anything to study. It'd be like going and studying, well, what's the impact of a grocery store? If the grocery store is in business and people are purchasing from the grocery store, then the grocery store is providing more benefits than it costs, and there's nothing that needs to be studied, really, in some sense, in that grocery store. Well, it turned out that some careful studies, and in particular, Jonathan Morduck was very influential, suggested that many of the microfinance institutions were actually quite heavily subsidized by governments and donors around the world. So there's a legitimate reason then to study these microfinance organizations. There's also other reasons, which is many microfinance organizations turned out to offer rather high interest rates for this borrowing. And so there was some fear by some quarters that maybe they were engaged in a version of what's sometimes called predatory lending. So rather than fostering the goal of improving people's lives over the long term, reducing poverty, they were in fact deepening the hole of poverty, further indebting people by cleverly taking advantage of behavioral predispositions that humans have to make bad choices because they lead to short-term gain, and discounting the longer-term negative effects of those bad choices. So you have some urgent need. You could reduce consumption, but then that might make you feel bad about yourself. A payday lender comes along and says, don't feel bad about yourself. Take this very short-term loan. You only have to repay 10%. But if the repayment is due 2 weeks from now, then the implicit interest rate there is enormous, more in the order of hundreds of percent at an annual basis. No one would borrow at that rate, but the behavioral constraint of humans often means that they perceive small absolute amounts to not be very important and not always calculate that very large relative amounts are the relevant criteria to use when making decisions like this. So credit programs started being studied increasingly, and there were critics who, especially for programs that were targeted for women, who argued that instead of empowering women, these programs were disempowering women, that very often men were using women as a front to obtain credit. Very often these loans were not generating increases in production, were being used to finance short-term consumption. And that some of these microfinance institutions had more characteristics of Ponzi schemes than they did of anti-poverty institutions. That is, they borrowed from banks, international donors at very low rates, loaned to poor people, maybe had not great records of collecting money from those poor people, but by promoting themselves as lending to poor people, they were able to secure more loans from donors or other organizations, which enabled them to pay off the earlier loans and continue in business and expand, and then convince more lenders that, look, we've been in business for 10 years now, and we keep lending and reaching more and more people, so we must be really good. That's what a Ponzi scheme does, right? Is convince more people to keep lending to it. And as long as things are going well, Ponzi schemes can last a long time until the day of reckoning comes, and they often suddenly collapse. So there's a variety of prudential reasons to be interested in careful evaluation by social scientists of these programs. My first experience with evaluating at a very small scale and on a qualitative scale was a credit program in Burkina Faso it's called Credit with Education, was sponsored by an organization called Freedom from Hunger that's still active now, almost 30 years since I did this evaluation. And this Credit with Education program had two components. One was a micro lending program and savings program, and the second was combining that with education about micro entrepreneurship and about empowerment and women's empowerment and things like that. So very much on the model of the Grameen Bank, which also combined that empowerment education message with the microfinance message. The Credit with Education program was very successful. When I evaluated the program in 1996, a kind of qualitative evaluation, a kind of a ground truthing of what their aggregate numbers were showing. You see a lot of variety, and in the chapter I described the variety of activities that women were engaged in, that they were using the loans to increase their capital. They were buying cooking pots. They were building up their market stalls themselves so that they could serve more customers. And they were achieving pretty good profits on the order of a couple of dollars a day extra, according to them. This is all basically self-reported. We aren't able to go and examine the books of these micro entrepreneurs because they're informal, mostly non-literate, and so they don't keep books, accounting books of how much they spent and how much they earned. So it's largely self-reported what these incomes are. Now, incomes were highly variable. There were quite a lot of differences amongst villages. So this was definitely something we suggested that the organization needed to spend more time understanding the very sizable differences in the loans and effects, likely effects of the loans for these borrowers. And there were a number of problems that we were able to identify that seemed to have been unaddressed in the program, and that we felt in the course of doing our evaluation, the program should spend more time addressing. In particular, the leadership of the joint liability was very problematic and needed to be sorted out as to what the actual procedures were when these organizations confronted difficulties in repaying the loans of everyone who was in the joint liability group. So I'll let you read that section because it's hopefully an enjoyable and relatively straightforward read. And just close this part two with, again, a number of a suggestion to read a number of the studies that summarized in the chapter on evaluations of microcredit programs. Some of the earliest evaluations of microcredit programs took advantage of their geographic limitations. So the microcredit program would say, we're going to operate in this area and not in any outlying areas, to do the kind of difference in difference study that we've talked about in the class. That is, looking at the people on this side of the program boundary and people on the other side of the program boundary. So the idea being that the program boundary itself is largely arbitrary. So whether people are on this side are eligible and people on that side are not eligible is largely random. And so one can estimate the difference in difference effect. How were these people doing on the credit side before the credit program compared with people on the other side? And then how did they change? How did they improve with access to the credit program? Lately, in the last 15 years, there have been some larger scale randomized control trials. Now, a big issue with randomized control trials in this setting is we very much might think that a micro entrepreneur getting access to credit might spill over, the effects might spill over to other micro entrepreneurs there. For example, if you were selling mangoes in the marketplace and you got a large loan to expand your mango sale business, but the mango sellers next to you didn't get those loans, you might make them worse off in the short run. They might decide to get out of the mango business and go into some other business. Now, economies change like that all the time. That's the nature of increases in productivity, is that the firms, the micro entrepreneurs that increase their productivity most rapidly expand, and firms that can't keep up have to reallocate their resources into other activities where they maybe have more comparative advantage. So there's nothing wrong about that. That's the essence of economic change, and in particular of growth, investing to increase productivity. But in terms of evaluation, then if you evaluate at that micro scale, you have the person getting the loan growing and the person who didn't get the loan contracting. So you might wrongly conclude that this microcredit program was amazingly effective. And that's because you are not taking into account the spillover effect, that the increase in benefits and expansion of opportunities for this entrepreneur is itself the cause of the reduction in profits for the other entrepreneur. So to properly evaluate the general equilibrium effects of microfinance, one should treat an entire area or an entire sector with the microcredit program, and then have other areas or other sectors that are left untreated. That's obviously much more expensive to designate, for example, 100 areas of a large city like Delhi, or like Nairobi in Kenya, or Lagos in Nigeria, and designate hundreds of areas in the city to receive microcredit, but have 100 control areas in the city to not receive microcredit, to not receive access. So that's going to be much more expensive to study, but quite a few, because microcredit has achieved the kind of scale where that's possible, quite a few studies like this have now been conducted over the last 10 or 15 years, and they generally are not that favorable to microfinance. They find typically fairly small effects, find large, very heterogeneous effects. Some people, some micro entrepreneurs benefit a lot from microcredit, many others don't benefit at all from microcredit, and of course some people are made worse off by microcredit. That is, the behavioral problems with humans mean that they're worse off in the end, right? Because they think they're going to do well. The microcredit promotes borrowing, they borrow, but then they don't do as well as they thought they were going to do, and so they end up being more in debt than they would have been if they hadn't had access to the microcredit. So lately, research has turned to trying to better identify, well, who are the more likely successful micro entrepreneurs in these settings? How can they be better screened for and selected for in microfinance borrowing? So some of those papers are listed in the chapter of the book. I encourage you to read that.